It is late July 2026. You pull up to the gas station, and the sign staring back at you reads $5.37 for a gallon of diesel.
Yeah, which is just a brutal number to see.
Right. And you check your phone, which, might just be one of the last affordable models available because the global advanced technology supply chain is literally evaporating into the atmosphere.
Evaporating, literally.
Exactly. And when you look up from that screen, you are seeing a country facing a level of domestic unrest that is really unprecedented in modern history.
It really is.
So today, we are opening up a stack of highly sensitive, highly politically charged intelligence briefings to find out exactly how we got here.
And before we jump in, we really need to emphasize to you, the listener, that we aren't taking sides here.
No, absolutely not. We are not spinning political narratives or endorsing any specific viewpoints from these sources. We are strictly unpacking the facts. We're just following the math of a global collapse, starting with a single military strike and mapping how it cascaded from the gasoline pump to computer chips to farm fields and finally to the streets of America.
Because it is the clinical definition of a perfect storm. If you look at the underlying data in these briefings, what we're seeing is a simultaneous convergence of macroeconomic destabilization, geographic chokeholds, and systemic supply chain paralysis. And it's hitting almost every foundational sector of the global economy at the exact same time.
So let's get right into the mechanics of this, because I want to understand how a localized kinetic event in February mutated into the structural strangulation we're seeing right now in July.
Right, the catalyst.
Yeah, the catalyst. The documents point to what the military called Operation Epic Fury. This was late February 2026. It was a massive unilateral U.S. and Israeli strike on Iran, targeting their leadership and nuclear infrastructure.
And tactically speaking, the briefings suggest it hit the intended targets.
But the geopolitical blowback was almost instantaneous, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. Iran retaliated with the most devastating asymmetric tool they have, which was completely closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Wow.
Yeah. We're talking about a 33-kilometer-wide waterway that is essentially the primary artery for global energy.
Right.
By trapping that choke point behind a wall of naval mines and anti-ship batteries, they effectively removed roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption from the board.
20%.
Just gone. Just gone. Along with up to 25% of the global supply of liquefied natural gas. The shock to the global energy nervous system was absolute.
So the U.S. government responds to this by throwing open the taps on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, right? Yep. They initiated a massive 172 million barrel drawdown.
Yeah, that was the immediate policy response.
And looking at the numbers in the brief, it feels like paying your mortgage with a high-interest credit card. Like you get to mask the deficit for a few months, and you can pretend your household budget is fine, but you are marching toward a very hard wall when that card finally maxes out.
That financial analogy translates perfectly to the physical reality of the SPR.
Yeah.
Analysts in the documents refer to this phase as buffer exhaustion.
Buffer exhaustion.
Right. The administration was draining the strategic reserve at an incredibly aggressive velocity of like 1.4 million barrels a day.
Which is huge.
It is. The sole objective was to artificially suppress global crude prices and insulate the American consumer from the shock. But the SPR is a finite physical cavern of oil. It is not a printing press.
Right. You can't just print more oil.
Exactly. And the tracking data shows that on July 9th, 2026, this strategic buffer effectively reached total functional exhaustion.
So it's just empty.
Empty. The safety net didn't just tear, it completely vanished.
Which means the timing of what happens next is just catastrophic. Because literally just days after the U.S. runs out of its emergency buffer, the crisis mutates into something much, much worse.
Yeah. On July 20, Houthi forces in Yemen announced a comprehensive maritime embargo targeting Saudi Arabia via the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
I want to pause here really quick because the geography is super crucial for this. After the Strait of Hormuz closed in February, Saudi Arabia didn't just stop selling oil.
No, they didn't.
They started bypassing that blockage by aggressively pumping roughly 4 million barrels a day through the East-West pipeline. They were sending it overland to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, putting it on ships and sending it out to the world.
And that overland pipeline was, it was basically the global economy's last remaining safety valve.
Right.
So the Houthi embargo explicitly targeted that exact bypass route. What began as a single choke point crisis in the Persian Gulf instantaneously hardened into a catastrophic dual choke point blockade.
A dual choke point. That's awful.
It's the worst case scenario. The Middle East's primary export corridors are now fundamentally severed. This forces the entire global shipping fleet into massive 11,000-mile detours around the southern tip of Africa.
Which just absorbs staggering costs.
Staggering in fuel, time, insurance premiums, everything just skyrockets.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be scratching your head. The U.S. had the shale oil revolution, We are widely considered a net petroleum exporter.
Yeah, on paper we are.
Right, so if we have our own oil domestically, why are you paying $5.37 for diesel? Why didn't our own domestic supply insulate us from this Middle Eastern choke point?
It comes down to a massive chemical mismatch known as the refining paradox.
Okay, the refining paradox. Walk me through that.
So the crude oil we pull out of the ground domestically from shale, as well as the oil we had stored in the SPR, is chemically categorized as light and sweet.
Light and sweet. Got it.
But if you look at the vast majority of our complex refinery infrastructure along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast, it was designed and built decades ago. Those facilities were physically engineered to process heavy, sour crude imported from places like Venezuela and the Middle East.
Okay, let me see if I can translate that factory mismatch. It's like having a high-tech kitchen perfectly calibrated to turn tough, raw root vegetables into a rich stew over like a 12-hour boil.
Okay, I follow.
If you suddenly back up a truck and dump delicate fresh strawberries into that exact same boiling vat, you don't get a better dessert. You just jam the equipment and ruin the food. Like, our refineries are calibrated for the tough stuff.
That is actually a great way to look at it. The engineering term for that is the turn-down ratio.
Or turn-down ratio.
Right. The complex conversion units in these refineries require a very specific fluid dynamic throughput to maintain their thermal functionality. If you pump light, sweet crude into a system built to crack heavy, sour crude, the equipment simply cannot efficiently break down the hydrocarbons into high-value middle distillates.
And middle distillates are?
Exactly what diesel and jet fuel are.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so domestic refiners could not physically absorb the SPR release to lower the cost of diesel for the American trucking industry.
The data reveals something even more frustrating, though. Because they couldn't use it efficiently, U.S. refiners actually exported a massive amount of that light SPR crude over to Europe.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. Europe was in the middle of an absolute aviation fuel crisis, canceling thousands of summer flights. So American refiners shipped our taxpayer-funded emergency reserves abroad just to capture sky-high global spot prices.
Which brings us to the total failure of the Jones Act waiver.
Oh yeah, let's talk about the Jones Act.
The administration attempted to provide domestic relief by waiving that 1920 law. Usually the Jones Act requires goods shipped between U.S. ports to be carried on American-made, American crude vessels.
Right, and the stated policy goal of the waiver was to flood the domestic market with fuel and support military logistics, right?
That was the pitch. But the June after action reports tell a very different story. Out of the 78 distinct voyages that occurred under this emergency waiver, exactly 0 of them actually assisted the military.
0.
0. They were carrying commercial fuels that failed to meet the strict specifications of the Department of Defense.
Wow.
Furthermore, the waiver essentially outsourced American domestic commerce to foreign manufacturing. The ships utilizing these routes weren't American. Nearly 60% of them were built in South Korea, and over 23% were constructed in China.
And the ultimate failure is really measured at the consumer level, isn't it? Because I saw an 11-week economic analysis in the sources that demonstrated domestic consumer prices didn't drop a single cent due to the waiver.
Not 1 cent. In some specific regional routes, the foreign freight rates actually proved more expensive than the domestic rates they replaced. It was basically an illusion of policy action masking a structural deficit.
So the physical ships are surviving the journey by taking this massive 11,000-mile detour around Africa. But while the physical ships are safe, the cargo they are carrying isn't.
No, especially not the high-tech stuff.
Right, because with advanced tech supply chains, you aren't just fighting geography, you're fighting thermodynamics. Let's talk about the device you're using to listen to this deep dive right now and why it's getting so incredibly expensive.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Back in February, retaliatory strikes hit Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city. In a single night, that kinetic event wiped out roughly a third of the world's supply of semiconductor-grade helium.
And helium is completely non-substitutable in advanced semiconductor manufacturing.
You can't just use something else?
No, you really can't. It is the only viable cooling agent for the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. the EUV machines that print the microscopic logic gates on cutting-edge microchips.
So what happens if you try to use, like, nitrogen or something?
You destroy the wafer yields, and you essentially melt the multi-million-dollar equipment. You cannot swap it out. But the real catastrophe wasn't just the strike on Qatar. It was the maritime detour effect you just mentioned.
Yeah, I was reading the briefing section on helium transport, and it sounded like shipping a ticking time bomb. You can't just put this gas in a standard tank and forget about it. If the ship takes too long to get from point A to point B, what actually happens inside those specialized containers?
Well, liquid helium has to be maintained at an extreme cryogenic temperature of minus 269 degrees Celsius.
Minus 269, that's almost absolute zero.
Exactly. It is transported in these highly specialized vacuum-insulated containers. But physics dictates that these containers have a strict thermodynamic holding limit, usually between 35 and 60 days.
Okay.
No matter how good the insulation is, heat ingress eventually occurs, which raises the internal pressure to critical levels.
Which means when the Strait of Hormuz closed and these massive cargo ships were forced to detour 11,000 miles around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid the Red Sea, the physical journey took longer than the 60-day holding limit.
Way longer. The extended transit fatally breached the thermodynamic constraints. As the internal pressure built up inside these cryogenic tanks, mandatory automated safety valves triggered.
To stop them from blowing up.
Yes, to prevent the containers from literally exploding on the cargo decks. They had to systematically vent the irreplaceable liquid helium out into the open atmosphere as boil-off gas.
Oh my God, they just vented it into the sky.
Literally just vented it.
Yeah.
By the time these ships finally docked in East Asia, they were delivering virtually empty containers.
Wow.
And this physical deficit immediately crippled South Korean semiconductor fabrication plants, causing global memory chip prices to violently spike by 50%.
Which brings up a glaring strategic vulnerability. If our technological supply chains are this paralyzed, how does this impact the U.S. military's ability to actually fight a kinetic war and forcibly reopen these blocked waterways?
Well, the U.S. defense industrial base is caught in a multi-vector chokehold right now.
Right.
The helium shortage is crippling the software and logic side of defense manufacturing, sure, but it also intersects with an impending physical hardware cliff in November 2026 regarding Chinese export controls on rare earth elements.
Rare earths.
Yeah. The U.S. military is fundamentally dependent on Chinese chemical engineering to process the rare earths required for modern asymmetric warfare.
The numbers in the procurement documents are just staggering to me. A single F-35 fighter jet requires over 920 pounds of refined rare earths just for its radar, stealth coatings, and targeting optics.
And a Virginia-class nuclear submarine requires over 9,200 pounds for its sonar and propulsion systems.
So what happens in November?
China has basically constructed an insurmountable regulatory and economic blockade. Under their new export rules, any foreign-produced defense component requires a rigorous Chinese export license if even 0.1% of its value stems from trace Chinese origin rare earths.
Oh, wow. So they just cut us off completely.
Completely. We lack the helium required to print the logic chips, and we are about to legally and physically lack the refined rare earths needed to build the hardware. It severely degrades the state's kinetic capabilities.
Okay, so I'm looking at these projections for 2027, and I'm struggling to connect some of the dots. Like, I completely understand how oil and microchips are globally integrated, but how does a maritime blockade in the Middle East ruin the American planting season for a farmer in Iowa a year later?
It seems like a leap, right?
It feels like a massive leap. How exactly does a shipping dispute destroy crop yields in the Midwest?
It feels totally disconnected until you realize that modern commercial agriculture is, at its core, a massive energy conversion process.
Okay, explain that.
It relies entirely on natural gas to produce synthetic fertilizers. The Persian Gulf is a foundational node for this exact chemistry. Prior to the blockade, the Gulf accounted for a massive percentage of global seaborne urea and ammonia exports.
Oh, okay.
They also export nearly half of the world's traded sulfur, which is a mandatory chemical precursor for making DAP fertilizer that's diammonium phosphate.
And the blockade trapped millions of tons of this critical chemical precursor inside the Gulf.
Exactly. Which leads to a terrifying data point from the North Dakota State University Center for Agricultural Policy. They track something called the fertilizer-to-corn affordability ratio.
Fertilizer-to-corn affordability ratio.
Right. This metric simply measures how many bushels of corn a farmer has to sell in order to afford purchasing 1 ton of fertilizer.
Let's compare that to the last major supply shock to put it in context. During the 2022 fertilizer crisis, commodity corn prices were actually quite high. So even though fertilizer was expensive, a farmer only needed about 110 bushels of corn to buy a ton of fertilizer. It squeezed their margins, but it was survivable.
Right, survivable. But in 2026, the macroeconomic environment is entirely different. Commodity crop prices are severely depressed. But because of the blockade, wholesale urea and DAP prices have skyrocketed. The ratio has violently crashed.
What's the number now?
It now takes up to 221 bushels of corn to buy that exact same ton of fertilizer.
Wow. It is essentially double the cost of doing business in real terms,
Doubled.
which mathematically guarantees that American farmers are going to purchase and apply significantly less fertilizer to their fields during the winter fill periods simply because they can't afford it.
And lower application rates equal massive crop yield destruction in the 2027 harvests. We are looking at locked-in, severe global food inflation, and it is completely decoupled from whatever crude oil prices do next. The die is already cast for the food supply.
Which brings us to the massive disconnect in these briefings. We have energy, technology, and food supply chains fundamentally breaking down. The physical reality on the ground is grim. Yet the U.S. government officially reported a 2.1% GDP growth for the first quarter of 2026.
Yeah, that 2.1% figure.
Right. How does the government's math square with the listener's reality of paying $5.37 for diesel?
The short answer is, it doesn't.
Not at all.
Not at all. The sources reveal what analysts are calling a cloaked recession, which is being hidden by deep data distortions. There is a structural divergence happening between GDP, which measures aggregate expenditures and consumption, and GDI, which measures actual aggregate income.
Okay, so spending versus making.
Exactly. The internal data shows a 1.9% truth-teller gap between the two. The headline GDP growth you see on the news is a statistical mirage. It's being driven by desperate debt-financed consumption and corporations hoarding inventory, while the actual income of the working class is rapidly contracting.
The documents also outline how the state's data collection apparatus itself has been fundamentally compromised. The executive branch utilized something called a Schedule F classification to unilaterally fire roughly 162,000 career federal civil servants.
Yeah, that was a huge move.
Can you explain the mechanism of how a bureaucratic firing spree actually changes the inflation map?
Well, Schedule F is an executive mechanism that strips employment protections from civil servants, reclassifying them as at-will employees. By firing 162,000 workers, the administration essentially blinded its own statistical sensory organs.
Blinded them how?
Without field agents and data scientists out there to collect real-world, ground-level pricing data, agencies like the Bureau of Labor Statistics had to rely on gross statistical imputations.
Which are what? Just guesses?
Basically plugging in highly optimistic guesses. For instance, they mathematically recorded a 0.0% change in rental costs for the entire month of October, artificially dragging down the official inflation reading.
0%. Anyone renting right now knows that's impossible.
Right. They are generating an economic narrative that is completely divorced from the physical reality.
And the reality of the government's own balance sheet is even more alarming. The briefings heavily reference something called Ferguson's Law.
Yeah, Ferguson's Law. It's a historical and economic principle stating that a sovereign entity crosses a terminal threshold of decline when its debt servicing costs exceed its defense spending.
And we cross that.
The U.S. quietly crossed that line. The annualized interest payments simply to service the national debt have reached $1.22 trillion in 2026.
$1.22 trillion just on interest.
Just on interest. That massive figure completely eclipses the entire $892 billion national defense budget.
Which means the Federal Reserve is trapped in a fiscal straitjacket, right?
Right.
Normally, if a central bank wants to fight supply-driven inflation, they aggressively raise interest rates to cool the economy. But if they raise rates now, that $1.22 trillion debt servicing costs spirals into hyper-exponential territory and bankrupts the government.
Raising rates triggers an immediate sovereign debt crisis. But if they capitulate and lower rates to save the government's balance sheet, energy and food inflation will run absolutely rampant, crushing the working class.
So it's an impossible choice.
It is an impossible mathematical trap. The professional and administrative classes are already reading the writing on the wall here. The briefings show a massive quiet migration of capital, with institutional wealth fleeing traditional fiat currency systems and seeking refuge in alternative digital and tokenized assets to escape the coming inflation.
While the professional class is quietly moving their capital into digital lifeboats, the working class is physically absorbing the reality of collapsing purchasing power. And they have violently rejected the state's statistical illusions.
You can see it on the streets.
Yeah, this narrative dissonance physically manifested in what the documents call the No Kings mobilizations.
The sheer scale of these mobilizations is staggering. The internal documents record the March 28, 2026 mobilization as the largest decentralized protest in modern American history.
Wow.
An estimated 8 to 9 million citizens participated across more than 3,300 documented rallies spanning all 50 states.
That is roughly 2.3% of the entire U.S. population taking to the streets on a single day. And alongside these protests, we saw immense coordinated labor disruption.
Right, the strikes.
In Minnesota alone, 100,000 participants engaged in a regional general strike. We are talking about nursing home workers, janitors, and transit workers, all citing the mathematical impossibility of surviving on standard 3% wage increases against compounding double-digit stagflation.
And this profound economic friction has now escalated into severe legal balkanization. We are seeing direct physical clashes between state and federal authorities.
Right.
The sources highlight Operation Metro Surge, which was a highly aggressive federal enforcement campaign launched by ICE in the Minneapolis area.
And keeping strictly to the facts documented in the briefings, this federal operation resulted in the tragic, fatal shootings of 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. The sheer outrage over these deaths led local municipalities like the city of St. Louis Park to formally engage in legal nullification efforts.
Yeah, it completely fractured the local cooperation.
I want to unpack that term. How exactly does a local city successfully block a federal enforcement surge?
Legal nullification at the municipal level works through a mechanism of absolute non-cooperation, leaning heavily on the 10th Amendment. The city of St. Louis Park passed binding resolutions denying ICE any access to local police resources, blocking the use of municipal holding facilities, and aggressively filing amicus briefs in federal court to tie up enforcement operations in endless litigation.
So they just bury them in paperwork and lock them out.
They essentially build an impenetrable bureaucratic and legal wall against federal agents. We are witnessing a profound collapse of institutional legitimacy and deep social fracturing, where local governments are actively warring against the federal apparatus.
Which brings us to the forward trajectory. Because the diplomatic attempts to fix the root cause of this have completely disintegrated.
In June, there was an attempt to broker a ceasefire and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, referred to as the Islamabad Memorandum. The U.S. Treasury even took the unprecedented step of issuing sanctions waivers to Iran to facilitate the deal.
But the physical maritime network, the massive shipping conglomerates and their insurance providers, they didn't trust a piece of paper. You can't just declare a heavily mined waterway open.
No, physically sweeping the Strait of Hormuz of advanced naval mines takes a minimum of 180 days of dedicated, highly dangerous work. The timeline for immediate relief was a total fiction.
And almost immediately, the diplomatic framework shattered. Renewed kinetic strikes occurred, Iran formally reclosed the strait, and the Office of Foreign Assets Control officially revoked the sanctions waivers in early July.
So the diplomatic avenue is effectively dead in the water.
So based on these briefings, what is the baseline reality for the rest of 2026?
The energy analysts inside the intelligence community outline that Scenario 3, which was once considered an extreme, worst-case tail risk, is now the absolute baseline.
The baseline.
Yeah. We are looking at a world where the SPR is completely empty, the dual choke point blockade in the Middle East is actively enforced, and the U.S. military is physically constrained by rare earth shortages. Under this specific model, the artificial stability of the paper energy market collapses. Brent crude is projected to violently spike toward the $120 to $150 per barrel threshold.
Translating that to the pump, it means U.S. retail gasoline averages could easily eclipse $5.20 a gallon, forcing the U.S. economy into a deep stagflationary recession with no remaining safety nets to deploy.
The global economy is violently transitioning from a managed supply disruption into an entirely unhedged structural deficit. Economic stability is no longer a function of monetary policy. It rests entirely on increasingly precarious, highly volatile geopolitics.
So what does this all mean for you? I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. We mentioned earlier that while the working class is forced into general strikes to survive, the professional administrative class is quietly fleeing the fiat system.
Right, the capital flight.
Exactly. The briefings note an incredible metric. The tokenized real-world asset market has expanded by nearly 600%, and institutional professionals have quietly migrated hundreds of billions of dollars into decentralized stablecoins to escape fiat inflation.
It's a massive shift.
So if the tokenized real-world asset market is exploding by 600% and the wealth of the professional class is quietly migrating hundreds of billions into decentralized networks to escape a paralyzed central bank, what happens to the power of a global hegemon if a critical mass of its own citizens fundamentally defects from its currency system entirely? Something to think about the next time you're staring at the numbers ticking up at the gas pump. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.